Thanks to Caroline for an important question in response to what I presented in class on this past class session. She writes this: I understand our propensity as humans to want to alleviate suffering and avoid pain. And I think Caroline is saying that she understands some of the dangers, perhaps, of rushing to alleviate suffering and avoid pain. But what about issues of justice? In some situations, just sitting with someone in pain doesn't feel appropriate when it is because of injustice. And she adds in parentheses, this is related to my tension with the book and how Vanier almost talked about those with disabilities interchangeably with the poor. Great question. And I think that you, Caroline, are pointing to something that simply does need to be developed both further and a little bit differently, depending upon the kind of suffering that we're talking about and how we understand its causes. Clearly, I would say that when someone is suffering because of injustice perpetrated against them, even a systemic, sometimes diffuse kind of injustice, simply sitting with them and suffering together without looking for a way to alleviate that suffering has got to be inadequate. Certainly, there are kinds of suffering for which vigorous advocacy for change, for justice, is a crucial way of responding to the suffering of people. So I don't want to overly generalize some of what I was emphasizing in class as always adequate. I think what I would want to say in relation to that kind of suffering that is relevant to what I was addressing is that often efforts to alleviate suffering rush so quickly, you might say, for what certain people with perceived power to alleviate that suffering, what they assume to be the solution, that it ends up reiterating the problem. So you can imagine an approach to poverty that simply thinks that it's a matter of moving some money around. And certainly moving some money around might be a first step, but that would be an inadequate way of dealing with suffering for economic injustice. There's got to be attention to the ways in which people find themselves without the monetary resources that they need to live a healthy life. And that's not just going to be a matter of moving money around. It's going to be a matter of changing how resources are generated, how we invest them, how we distribute them, all of those kinds of things. And I think that the ability to pursue that kind of justice depends on sitting together as people who are enduring oppression, people who are going to advocate with those people, sitting patiently with them, so that efforts at reform can be informed by the experience and the particular suffering of the people for whom justice is being sought, as opposed to manufacturing a solution from another place that's not really informed by the particular suffering that is in view. And so I still think that there is a need in this sense for a certain kind of patience in the face of suffering, so that the efforts at reform can actually address the problem rather than rushing in a way that supposedly fixes something but doesn't deal with the underlying problem, perhaps aggravates it or often reiterates it. I find this is especially true with issues of power, where people are sort of patronized in the way that their claims to justice are treated, so that a kind of quick Band-Aid is thrown at them or something like that. And it might seem like relief in a superficial sense, in a short-term sense, but its effect is not actually to empower those who have been enduring injustice to be agents in the quality, the health of their lives as part of the justice that they seek. And so that, I think, is cause for learning the sort of patience that will enable people to collaborate effectively in pursuit of justice, rather than settling for false solutions that might reiterate or even aggravate the suffering of those enduring injustice. So that's, I think, one way to think about that. But you make a very good point that if we overgeneralize some of what living gently in a violent world is advocating, I think that we will not respond adequately to certain kinds of violence, including various kinds of injustice that people are facing. But I'd still want to say that there's something about gentleness, if we don't overly romanticize it, that does actually strengthen the ability of people to pursue and receive justice as they work on that together. One other thing I think I might add is how this was something I was planning to say in the second part of class. We just didn't get to it. And I think I might put up a longer recording of that. That will be optional. But this use of the term poverty or the poor, I think it would be a mistake, as I think you're implying, Caroline, to simply equate the situation of those who have been impoverished by disabilities, disabilities that are partly the result of something that they may have been born with, for example, and the poverty of people who are economically oppressed. Those are not the same condition, and they deserve to be distinguished. But what I think we should keep in mind, a couple things. First of all, it is true that in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts, people are described as poor, often partly because of something we might describe as a disability. So a blind person, for example, is grouped as the poor. And the purpose for that, or I think if we make sense of that in the text of Luke and Acts, and this involves, for example, Jesus's manifesto that he's been sent to bring good news to the poor, sight to the blind. The reason they're grouped together is that the problem with that people are facing who are blind in Luke and in Acts is not simply that they lack money. It's that they lack power. Their lack of a certain kind of sight keeps them in the systems of power and relationship that have been established from being able to provide for themselves a daily wage to begin with, but more than that, there are all kinds of other relational resources that they lack because they do not have a certain kind of sight. And so good news for the poor, what it means for them is not just providing them with a certain measure of economic stability. It means dealing with the manifold causes of their impoverishment, some of which is due to their being blind. And for a person to receive sight who is blind is not just about their being able to see when they couldn't before. It's also about now their ability, for example, to work for themselves, to communicate in relationships in a way that previously they hadn't been able to. And so The gospel is good news for them as part of this grouping of people, of the poor, because of how it addresses the manifold conditions that contribute to their plight, which is not simply blindness as we conventionally understand it, but the wider social and economic conditions that make blindness the painful thing that it is. And so seeing the relationship here between what we might think of as economic poverty and disability poverty can be helpful, even though they shouldn't be collapsed into one another, but it can be helpful because it helps us to see how the difficulties of people classified as disabled and the difficulties of people we now think of as poor are related to one another because of the sorts of dynamics of society that make their condition what it is. Conditions that produce economic poverty systemically, and at the same time make life painful and suffering that it doesn't need to have for people classified as disabled. There's a general lack of integration, a general lack of burden sharing. And so I think that's where some comparison, although not identification, between poverty and certain kinds of disability can be useful. The main point here is just to put these conditions in a larger context to be able to recognize what their relationships are, so that in our efforts to pursue justice, to pursue healing, to pursue wholeness and healthy community for people, we're not isolating certain conditions as if they can be addressed kind of atomistically as some kind of unique isolated problem, as opposed to something that is at least partly a function of the system of power and social relations, economic relations that is in place and needs to be addressed, not just in those isolated cases, but systemically in terms of how a community is organized, how it understands itself, what its commitments are, what its structures are, et cetera. So thanks again, Caroline, for a great question. Feel free to reply, by the way, if my response leaves you with further questions or concerns. I'm happy to keep the conversation going.